2005, I took a trip across Afghanistan. I actually took the bus. I remember I went from Kandahar to Kabul to Mazar-e-Sharif, Jalalabad. I went across the entire country, and I was doing research at that time on the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program in Afghanistan, which is designed to take ex-combatants, people who were fighting in the war over the course of over 2 decades, and have them reintegrated into society. So I was a young researcher, early in my career, and I went about meeting with all of these militiamen across the country. And as I took the bus from Kabul all the way up to Mazar-e-Sharif, which is in the north, and in order to do that, you have to literally go up through the mountains and then descend down from them. And there was this particular pass that I had to pass through called Salang Pass, which is a tunnel that was built by the Russians during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. And that tunnel was built so that the Soviet tanks could come in and reinforce the soldiers who had been stationed in Afghanistan as part of that military occupation. So as I passed through this tunnel in Salang Pass and then descended down into the valley, what I saw was literally the valley was like a war memorial. The entire countryside was literally scattered with tanks and armored personnel carriers that were blown out, literally still in battle formation. It was a really striking visual image, a really striking scene. And as I passed through one of these villages, within this valley, all of the children in the village had come out and were playing in one of these blown out tanks, like it was a jungle gym. And they were, all gathered together. And just like you'd imagine kids here in North America playing in a playground, these children were literally playing in this blown out tank. And I had an epiphany at that moment. I had a moment of realization, because here I was trying to understand how we could get ex-combatants reintegrated into society so that they could participate in a new peaceful society. But that program was only designed to take in the militia, the combatants who were on the government side of the conflict. It completely excluded those people who had participated on the other side of the war. And as I looked at these kids in this blown out tank, I had this moment where I could forgive absolutely everybody who had ever harmed me. And it was so easy. It just left me in this moment. It was one of those moments of sublime. And at that moment, I realized that, the solution to this is that everybody needs to come back. Because everything that can be done to a human being has been done to a human being in Afghanistan, and everybody knows it. It's not a secret. And if we take every single person who has participated in the war, whether it's murder, rape, the genocide, and round them up, and every perpetrator, we try to kill that person, we become the perpetrator. So I realized that everybody needs to come back. And it was at that point that I made the conscious decision that, what I need to do, what I need to focus on is not just on disarming and reintegrating one side, but reaching out to the other side as well. So I began my work in working across that line that we call enemy line, and reaching out to people who are actively participating in the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan. But I needed to learn more. I needed to understand this a little bit deeper. So I traveled to another part of the world as well, a country called Somalia, which is in the Horn of Africa. And for those of you who are not familiar with Somalia, Somalia has been at war for 22 years. Since 1991, the state fell in 1991, and Somalia regularly ranks number 1 on the failed state index. The entire countryside fell into a state of anarchy. And each individual community broke up into different warlord fiefdoms and was governed by a group of warlords who engaged in every form of human rights abuse and war crime imaginable. The thing about Somalia that's really remarkable is there's this one area in the north that made the decision early on in the war that it would separate from the rest of the country and they decided to engage in their own peace process. So by 1991, the entire country, the north and the south, was in a state of complete chaos. But this northern area, this province that called itself Somaliland, made the conscious decision to engage in its own peace process. There was no international intervention. There was no major peace-keeping force from the United Nations. This was an entirely indigenous, autonomous process. And what happened is through this indigenous peace process, Somaliland has actually built a self-sustaining democracy and a free market economy that has been at peace while the southern region has fallen into anarchy and chaos over the past 20 years. So I visited both the south, which is literally an absolute, catastrophe. Every single building that you see is shelled, literally looking like Swiss cheese. And then the north, where there was peace and security, and I went to visit the government in the north to ask, what exactly did you do? How did you accomplish this? So I spoke to some of the commanders who were actively involved in the civil war and who now formed the new government, and to ask them, what did you do? How did you make this work? And I was struck by their response. So in this historic peace process in 1993, all of these commanders came together, and while there was no international support really for this peace process, a local community hosted these commanders so that they could all engage in conversation. And they made a decision at that time to stay true to this process, which took 5 months. And they hosted this conference, this peace conference, under the shade of the trees in this town called Burama. And the Burama Peace Conference, which went on for this extended period of time, brought together both the winners and the losers, the dominant factions and the minority factions of the Civil War. And I talked to the generals who were involved in this peace process, who had been fighting on the battlefield and then formed this new government. And I said, well, what did you do? And the message that I got back was consistent, that the winning faction in the Civil War made the conscious and concerted decision not to take revenge and not to exploit that opportunity for their own gain. One of the generals said to me, Aisha, we had to make the decision to forgive because forgiveness was essential for reconciliation, and we needed to reconcile in order for this country, for this society to come back. And I thought, okay, these sound like high-flying ideals, big concepts. But then I pushed back a little bit more to see how does that work in reality? How does that work in practice? And what they actually did is this was not just, rhetoric. It was not just big principle. But at this historic peace process, they actually took the commanders of the losing faction and made the decision to give those groups, these leaders, these commanders, responsibility over the newly developed national police force. So I looked at them, you just beat them in the Civil War. You just won. And now you're appointing your defeated enemy to a senior position in the new security forces. Why would you do that? And one of the generals said to me, Aisha, we knew that we had to have everybody on board, and that if we excluded anybody, we were destroying the peace from within. So this principle of forgiveness operationalized over the course of this 5-month process was, produced an outcome of a sustainable, peaceful society without the $100 million intervention, without the big resources coming from, the international community. This was something that a community decided to do itself. Now, you might think that these still sound like some high-flying ideals, that how do we do this? How do we do this when it actually hits home? And I understand that, I know that, because, as you do this kind of work over the course of a decade, It does come home. And I remember, a couple of years ago, this really came home for me, where I had to take these principles that I had learned through my work in peace building and see whether or not they could really stand, the challenges that, face us at the individual level. A couple of years ago, a dear friend of mine, who I loved very much, was actually kidnapped in the tribal areas of Pakistan while he went on a peace mission. They held him for 10 months. And then one day I got the call. The group that had him, they executed him and put it on a propaganda video, posted it on the internet. It was at that very time in my life that I was actively working on coming up with a list of people who we needed to include in the negotiation process, who we needed to include in that peace process. And I can tell you from my ocean of despair and my ocean of grief, that list of names went from being a list of names that I sought to reconcile, to a list of names that I sought wiped from this earth. And my first feeling was I just wanted to napalm the entire area. So what do you do? What do you do when every single day from weeks on end your face is wet? What do you do when that violence that we confront out there in the world, in work, as peacemakers, what do you do when that comes home? Because the purpose of that violence, the function of that violence, it's not just to kill my friend. The function of that violence in that very moment was to take every surviving person who was working for peace and turn them into a perpetrator. And I felt it in that moment. I went right from peacemaker to warmonger in my heart. So what do you do when that happens? I can tell you that the first thing that I learned, having done this work for many years and having had the courage of other people who have overcome violence, my colleagues in Somaliland, those fighting for peace in Afghanistan and Pakistan, their courage helped me in that moment to, number one, you don't write your policy prescriptions when you want to napalm the entire world. That you take that moment of pause, because your emotion of grief, emotions, which are legitimate and appropriate, have their own time, but the principles of forgiveness are timeless. So I could, while in my state of grief, while in my state of emotional reaction, say that I am in the process of holding to my principles of forgiveness. That was how I could go through each and every day. And that was the way that I could stay on the side of continuing to work as a peacemaker rather than becoming a participant. And that is the way that each and every one of us constructs and creates the world that we live in, is how we respond in those moments. It's every time we tweet, every time we blog, every time we like something, every time we react. Because in the very same way that September 11th, it wasn't really about killing. The intent was not about killing 3,000 Americans, but about transforming every single person who survived into a participant. And stepping back from that and realizing that, okay, in this moment of my grief, how do I choose to respond to it? Who am I going to be in this world? As much as it feels like anger is the empowering emotion, as much as it feels like the reaction is a place of strength, I have learned that it is a place of weakness and it is a place of failure. And the solution for me was to forgive. Not in the sense that I condone Not in the sense that I accept the violence that was done against my friend as acceptable in any way. No, it is not the same thing. But rather, to make the conscious decision to say that, yes, you too, who killed my friend, you too can come back. You too can be redeemed. And how on earth could the person who did that know that they can come back? How could that idea even be conceivable unless that person knows that they can be forgiven? And the only way that they know that they can be forgiven is if I make the decision right now, right here, to say it. I forgive you. And I think you can come back. And that is the way that I can respond today to violence, to continue to be a peacemaker in this world. And it's the way that all of us get to do that. It's the way that all of us get to participate in this world. And it is in our response to that violence that we construct our human experience. And I have seen it both in the way the Somaliland peace process came together, and in a very personal way, that we do have agency in making our world a more peaceful place. Thank you.